Hello, genealogists. This is Craig, and this is Just Genealogy. And today we are going to continue our discussion in regards to military bounty land, and we will be focusing on colonial bounty land prior to the Revolution.
Caesar is an individual who was one of the first to recognize that you can compensate soldiers with land, and recognize that whenever you have an empire or you have a West, like in the West, west of the Mississippi, one of the things the government has is lots of land. And then you have a problem of figuring out how to put population on it, because if you can't put any population on it, you know what you can't do? Keep the land. Rome saw it as a way to relieve population in the more civilized Roman areas by farming all those soldiers out to the hinterland. Remember, the gladiator was from Spain. Recognize the last thing you want is retired soldiers near your seat of government. It's not really a good idea. And also, again, the permanent reward without an outlay of cash. I mean, you can be land poor, but that doesn't happen to empires and imperialistic folk. And you would want those trained soldiers on the frontier to defend for free what they had in fact received from the government. And in fact, the frontier towns in Massachusetts are an example of a ring of towns that were set up so that they would be a buffer between the civilized white folk and the not so civilized white folk, and then the Native Americans. Now, England had a policy of granting land to soldiers, largely through the border wars in Wales and Scotland. So they would settle British soldiers in Wales and Scotland, and then also in Ireland. So that's very common. And I was just talking to somebody the other day about a British pensioner abroad. There's a book on those relating to North America, but this was an individual who was a British pensioner who was in Australia. Yet it was administered from Chelsea Hospital in the United Kingdom. So you would look at Chelsea Hospital records for them, for example. So England has a long history of bounty land. Colonial bounty land was a thing because we wanted to move people away from places like Boston out into the hinterland to create the buffer. Because remember in King Philip's War that the Indians came all the way to Cambridge and wiped out everybody in between. So we want to create frontier settlements that are more or less military in nature. So Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York designated some settlements as military towns. And the difference between a frontier settlement and a military town was if you got land in a military town, you could not leave without permission. Whereas in a regular town, if the Indians attack, you could get out of Dodge. But in a military town, you couldn't. You had to stay and fight. Otherwise, you would lose your land. And this colonial bounty land was granted for past services. So each colony created its own laws relating to regulating the militia and the bounty land that came with being part of the militia. And what we're dealing with is free white males here, normally between 16 and 60, but it may vary by time period. And as I say, it varies by colony. So you need to look at the statutes in the individual colony. The statutes you want to look for in Virginia are called Henning statutes at large. So there were exemptions for conscientious objectors. There were government officials. Of course, there were exemptions for government officials. And it was possible under most circumstances to provide a substitute if you actually didn't want to serve. Colonial governor was the commander-in-chief, and he caused training to be performed on a periodic nature. And basically this was weapons drill and military discipline. They'd meet on the commons once a month, and if you didn't show up, you got fined. So the records for some places, the only records that exist are the records of being fined for not showing up, not the records of actually showing up, because they made the list because you weren't there and you would get fined. But some muster rolls and payrolls, of course, are being created. And again, those muster rolls and payrolls are used to demonstrate that you weren't present. So there are multiple ways of demonstrating you weren't present. If you've got Quakers, you'll find they're often not present, and they're often refusing to pay the fines. In New England specifically, there were significant land grants for almost every battle that took place in New England, let alone a war. You could be enlisted for a few days and still be entitled to land. And again, the reason that they're doing this is to populate that frontier, because as that population moves west, then civilization can move west also. But you have to maintain that buffer of people who have some knowledge of military stuff. So the problem is that published accounts of these bounty land transactions are few and far between, but most of the information will come from the original manuscript collections, either in the Massachusetts Bay records, the Massachusetts State records, Rhode Island, Connecticut State Papers, New York, those kind of places. So what you want to do is look for it in the individual state archives for things like land grant petitions, and they can be done by individuals and by groups. A lot of times they're going to settle these military towns with a regiment, meaning this is a regiment that served together and everybody in that regiment went and settled that military town. That creates a situation where everybody knows everybody else, and that's a leg up when dealing with a town on the frontier, because you know who you trust and who you don't. So you can look at New Hampshire town charters. You can look at town histories. And almost every New England town has a town history, maybe out of print, may only be able to be found on Google Books or Haiti Trust or archives.gov, but most town histories exist in one form or another. Anyone interested in the history of Keene, New Hampshire, let me know. I have a palette full. So Google Books is your friend. Now this is another place. Remember I talked about statutes at large in last talk that I put everybody's name in? I put everybody's name in Google Book search also. So this is another place that you should put all your ancestors, because you have absolutely no idea what's going to pop up. None whatsoever. Of course, knowing that the individual that you end up with is actually your ancestor is an entirely different question. There were earlier conflicts where bounty land was granted after the fact, but King Philip's War was the first time that they said, fight this war, you'll get bounty land. Before they even fought the war, they knew that they were going to be getting bounty land. Connecticut and Massachusetts parcel out land to soldiers during the Pequot War. King Philip's, the war freed up huge tracts of land because as the Indians, Native Americans came to Cambridge, they just pushed them all the way back. Now, King Philip's War is very important to us because the colonists were using matchlocks and the Indians were using French-supplied flintlocks. The matchlock was the kind of thing that stood on a pole and you could fire a shot, and then it was like loading a cannon. And a flintlock, you could get 3 or 4 or 5 shots off to one matchlock. So the Indians were winning. God love the French. So because of this, the Massachusetts Assembly required that after this, every man own a flintlock. And gradually, over the course of time, all of the colonial assemblies required that every man own a flintlock. Now, this surprised the British because when they started fighting us, everybody had a weapon. And everybody was making their own ammunition and getting their own powder. In the beginning of the war, at least, not during the war, but in the beginning of the war, they were surprised that everybody was shooting at them with everything. There were a bunch of tracts created by King Philip's War. There was Voluntown in Connecticut, and then there were 7 Massachusetts Narragansett tracts. And if you go out to Google Books, you'll find individuals who actually were in some of these places. So this was not an afterthought. This is the first time that we deal with it not being an afterthought. It's preconceived that we want to fix it so this never happens again. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to create these Narragansett tracts and we're going to fill them up with people that have flintlocks. So it was called a gratuity of land, and that if they played the man, took the fort and drove the enemy out of the Narragansett country, which was their great seat, then they should have a gratuity of land beside their wages. Well, they took the fort, but the government did not act on the promised land until 1685, when petitioners from several Essex County, Massachusetts towns, as well as Hingham, petitioned for the land. So this meant that most of the soldiers in King Philip's War were already dead and ended up going to their grandchildren. So here's Templeton and Worcester County. This comes from Google Books, and basically from it, you'll also learn that here's Israel Town, son of Joseph and Margaret Case Town, born at Topsfield, and it provides sufficient genealogy information that you would want to find it if you were interested in Isaac Town, and then information about the Narragansett townships where the grandchildren actually were able to settle. Grants get done some 40 years after they were laid out. Well, 40 years is 2 generations, right? Originally, some of them required 30 families and a minister to populate the town within 4 years. But and again, it was many times sons and grandsons who eventually took up the land. These grants were by regiment, so the settlers in each new town knew each other and served together. And they were laid out on the frontier from Springfield, Massachusetts, northeast to Portland, Maine, to plug all the holes in their defense. In Pennsylvania, the heirs of William Penn, John, Thomas, and Richard, they owned all the land, and they were responsible for its disposal. And they were one of the few places that actually purchased land from the Native Americans in order to do that. That sounds good, but it probably was not as good as we think it was on reflection. They purchased a large tract of land that went as far west as the Allegheny Mountains in 1754. So recognize that Pennsylvania is not as big as we think it is, just like New York is not as big as we think it is in this time period. And it sold for about 15 pounds for 100 acres. I wish I could buy 100 acres for 15 pounds. New York, if you go out to the New York State Archives, they have sections on the Colonial War patents. So you want to look for those. These are all part of the New York State papers. And they're called Military Patents 1764 to 1797. South Carolina, its information is out on their website. And Virginia, in 1630, the Governor's Council offered grants of land to persons who settled on the frontier. Didn't work out well. Nobody wanted to fight Native Americans. In 1746, they tried again and they issued patents to the fort captains and the men for the lands on which the outlying forts were built. These forts were built by the Commonwealth of Virginia, and they were built along the lands they were built and the people got lands around the forts. In 1701, they tried again, and again another unsuccessful attempt to garrison the frontier. And then in 1763, following the French and Indian War, bounty lands were offered as an incentive or reward to men who performed military service during the French and Indian War. However, the area in which the land was available was closed by the king and the King's Proclamation of 1763. So it was not until 1779 that Virginia, now that we're in the midst of the Revolution, is able to actually reward bounty land for the French and Indian War. So that King's Proclamation of 7 October 1763 gave field officers 5,000 acres, captains 3,000 acres, subalterns or staff officers, that's lieutenants, ensigns, captains, not captains, but lieutenants, basically, ensigns, those kind of people, cornets, 2,000 acres. You know what a cornet is? The cornet, the musical instrument, doesn't come into being until 1828. But there was a television show a while back that said this guy was a musician in the Revolution, but he was a cornet. And a cornet actually is a cavalry ensign, the flag bearer of a cavalry unit. Non-commissioned officers, these are the corporals and the sergeants, 200 acres, and a private 50 acres. And there's a book by Wilson, actually 2 books combined together, Wilson and Taylor, that deal with the Revolution and the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is actually part 2 of this book. So it's interesting. This book is laid out. So there's a copy of the Proclamation of 1763 first. Then there's the Revolutionary War bounty land. And then there's the French and Indian War bounty land. Very strange. Their land office grants in the Library of Virginia. And there is a research note that deals with it that you'd want to download. Other colonies, the proclamation applied to them, and those people were entitled to land except for one thing. There was a revolution. And when Isaac Putnam and among others from Connecticut petitioned the Supreme Court to say, the state of Connecticut is not giving us our land that we earned during the French and Indian War, the Supreme Court said, in so many words, basically they said, we had a war, we don't have a king anymore, you're not getting your land. So Virginia, by jumping the gun in 1779, was able to give their soldiers bounty land, but nobody else acquired land under the King's Proclamation for the French and Indian War.
So this has been Craig, and this is Just Genealogy, and we'll put colonial bounty land to bed, and tomorrow we'll pick up with state bounty land during the American Revolution and after. See you tomorrow.